Hello, my name is Maggie Hartley, and I am joining you guys from the National World War II Museum as the Assistant Director of Public Engagement. So thank you for joining us for the latest installment of our Real History film series, which seeks to promote film related to World War II through full-length feature films, documentaries, and more. Today's program is about the documentary Serving for Justice. This documentary was executive produced by Stephen W. Jones and Arthur R. Collins, founders of Ebony Doughboys Productions. Serving for Justice tells the story of a combat unit struggling to succeed in battle and to prove their full citizenship even when their lives seem to matter less during World War II. So while we're not able to screen the documentary like we normally would for an in-person real history program, we are going to take a moment, so bear with us as we transition into showing you guys the trailer.
The men of the 333rd carried the dream of equality with them. They knew that they had to stand out, train harder, fight tougher, and win their victory at home.
XI 300. Well ready, sir.
The Allied push into the continent was rapid. The 333rd was called upon time and time again. Answering their nation's call, Black Americans enlisted in great numbers. They saw World War II as blacks before them had seen their wars as an opportunity to prove themselves equal to fellow white Americans. The equality and respect they had long sought since the end of the Civil War, they believed, was almost within their grasp. Many black soldiers would go on to distinguish themselves in heroic acts of valor, including the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. President Truman, via Executive Order 9981, would integrate the U.S. Armed Forces. This is perhaps one of the few, if not the first instance, where the military led its own nation in a social policy which would take its government another 17 years to enact in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Their story is a human one, underscored by the selfless humanitarian act of one Belgian family and the sacrificial gratitude of 11 war-weary American soldiers. These men were brothers, sons, and fathers. They served because, like us, they believed in the values we hold dear: freedom, justice, liberty. They believed in the greater good. For this, we are thankful for their service.
Wow. Again, I want to encourage you guys, if you have not yet seen this documentary, to take the time to do so. I'll give you guys some instructions on how to do that at the end. But today, I am honored to be joined by two of the filmmakers, Rob Child and Dr. Jeffrey Sammons, who will be sharing about the documentary and also, give me just a second. It kept playing the trailer afterwards and went into an ad. But they're going to be sharing about the documentary and what inspired them to create it. So Rob and Dr. Sammons, would you guys like to introduce yourselves?
Rob, you're muted. You're good.
Am I good now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Well, I was just inviting you to go first, Dr. Simmons.
No, you go first. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm honored to be here as well, Maggie, and welcome everyone to the webinar. Yeah, this is an amazing film that was produced by two excellent producers. And it's, I can get into it when you ask me about how it came to be, but I've done a lot of military history films and books, and this was one of the more, I don't know, heartfelt projects I've done. And I'm very proud of it. So I'll toss it over to you, Jeff.
I'm professor of history at New York University, and my second book is co-authored with John H. Morrow Jr., Harlem's Rattlers and the Great War, the Undaunted 369th Regiment and the African American Quest for Equality. And I also teach war films course at New York University. And so I have a great interest in military history and believe that military history has been given short shrift by African American historians and in African American history. And I believe it deserves a central place in the Black freedom struggle. And serving for justice, of course, is an important element in that overall history and experience.
Absolutely. So before we jump into the questions that I have for you guys today, I would like to remind our audience that there will be time for questions and answers at the end of the program. So if you have any questions and you're watching from Zoom, please put them within the Q&A feature. And if you're watching on Facebook, just leave it as a comment on the video and we will get to them in just a little bit. So my first question for you guys is, could you tell me more about how you both became interested in World War II history?
Well, I did a film. I was brought a film actually 13 years ago about the World War II glider pilots, the American glider pilots. And this producer brought it to me because he was passing the baton. He had run out of money and he said, you know, can you take this across the finish line? And it was an amazing story. And that was the first film I did on World War II. And I was able to get Hal Holbrook to narrate it. Walter Cronkite and Andy Rooney were participants in it. And it came out very, very well. And what I loved about that is the distributor was able to push Congress to actually honor the glider pilots with a resolution in Congress using the film as a catalyst. They hadn't been honored since World War II. And they created a resolution to finally honor the glider pilots after 65 years.
Wow.
So that was my first film in World War II. That was how I got started.
Of course, you know, World War II is probably the most filmed war of all, both in real documentary film, but also Hollywood. I was a big fan of World War II films, and before I knew John Wayne's politics, I was a big John Wayne fan, and the sands of Iwo Jima stick out. And of course, the Battle of Midway is one of my favorite war films of all time. And then later on, Catch-22, which had a very different take on World War II. And of course, I teach Catch-22 today. But also, Harlem's Rattlers is about the 369th Regiment, which was the 15th New York National Guard and the first Black National Guard unit in New York State. And it focuses on World War I, but we take the story through World War II. And so that's another reason for my interest in World War II. And World War I and World War II are so connected. In fact, one led to the other. The war that was to end all wars ends up creating another war, but also the treatment of Blacks in World War I was repeated in World War II And of course, that period between the wars is really critical to understand as well. One of the things I wanted to say about the trailer, while it's fresh in the minds of our participants, is that the gentleman in the Navy uniform receiving a medal, which was probably the Navy Cross, was Doris Miller, better known as Dory Miller, who served with the United States Navy and was at Pearl Harbor during the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but was a ship's steward, worked in the galley, and that was the only role that blacks could play in the United States Navy at the time. One of the anti-aircraft gunners was shot down from his perch, and Dory Miller took his place and proceeded to shoot down Japanese fighter planes. And the Navy didn't want to acknowledge what he had done, and there was extreme pressure brought to bear on the Navy by the Black community, and especially the civil rights leaders and organizations. And that's a story that also repeats itself. And finally, he was given the Navy Cross. Unfortunately, Dory Miller died later in World War II. There's also a movement now to have Dory Miller receive the Medal of Honor. And in the meantime, there is a ship that has been commissioned in his name, an aircraft carrier, the United States Dory Miller. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned him, because that people might wonder who was the sailor who appears in that trailer.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things I appreciated about this documentary was how you guys did cover, you placed the 333rd Field Battalion within the greater context of what was going on for Black Americans during World War II. And I also appreciate how you both have found this wanting to tell these untold stories as really what drives your passion for World War II. And so thinking along those lines, what inspired you guys to tell this story in particular about the 333rd?
Well, the producers came to me, as I referenced before, with this project. It actually was originally planned for the Belgian embassy, the U.S. Belgian embassy, a presentation in 3 parts on the cultural factors, the Jim Crow factors, the following the 333rd, and then the post factors of their service. So this began as a presentation for the U.S. Embassy in Belgium. But because of the pandemic, everything shut down. And we were left with, things were written, things were produced, filmed, and, we were kind of left wondering what we're going to do. So I suggested to the producers, Art and Stephen, I said, why don't we make it a documentary? We've got the components here. I have, a distributor, Jansen Media, who has several of my films. We could, put it into an hour format and bring it to them. And they said, absolutely, let's do that. So we, reconfigured and, re-edited it. And that's how we came up with the documentary, but it didn't start that way. So.
And I think it's really important that this is an artillery unit, because we think of Blacks in world wars as at most infantry, especially in World War I, but many times in service positions where they actually, pioneers, but also quartermaster corps, sanitation corps, burial corps in World War I, and and later on, of course, we will know about the Tuskegee Airmen, and to some extent, Black tank battalions because of their association with Patton. But artillery units are probably the least discussed, and it raises an interesting question about blacks dealing with complicated, sophisticated, uh, weaponry, and often not credited with being able to handle that. There's another interesting dimension to artillery, uh, is that they can be placed with white units and still be separate. They are kind of support for white units. And in fact, the 369th Regiment in World War II became a coastal anti-aircraft artillery unit. And if they hadn't become that, they wouldn't have been able to participate in combat. And that's because they could be easily placed in support of white units, but still remain separate and apart.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that. I think it is important to recognize that, you know, we were dealing with segregated units and often relegated to support roles. And this also brings to light the fact that we had Black soldiers fighting for freedom abroad that they did not necessarily receive at home. And one of the things you touched about in the documentary is the WWII campaign. So could you guys elaborate a little bit more on this and the campaign in particular?
Well, the WWII campaign begins rather inauspiciously or serendipitously. James G. Thompson, a 26-year-old cafeteria worker at a military installation in Wichita, Kansas, writes a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier and asks the question, why should I sacrifice my life to be considered a half American? And on the base, it just took off, this letter to the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier. And Robert Vann was the editor of the Courier, and decided from that, along with Robert Abbott of the Chicago Defender, and the Defender had a much bigger circulation than the Pittsburgh Courier, that they would actually launch a WWII campaign, which stood for victory at home and victory abroad, so that Blacks were not going to sacrifice their lives without asking for something in return. They believed that those who had served and sacrificed in World War I didn't receive anything basically for their service. And in fact, they did receive something, and that was denigration and disparagement, the lack of recognition for the heroism. And when I talk about disparagement, individuals, and very important individuals such as Robert E. Lee Bullard, who was the commander of the Second Army in World War I. And of course, he's named for the leader of the Confederate Army. And Alan Greer, who was a chief of staff to the 92nd Division, who basically said that Blacks were only capable of fighting women and children, that they were basically afraid of their own shadows. They were useless as soldiers and even more as officers. And this would become codified, formalized in a 1925 War College report on the Negro in the World War, that would basically lead to almost a total elimination of Black soldiers from the American military. So there are all kinds of questions when we get to World War II about the role that Blacks are going to serve in the military. And of course, as the trailer to the documentary shows, that Blacks believe that military service was integrally linked to their being able to claim full citizenship rights. And this goes back to the French and Indian War, or certainly the Revolutionary War. And one of the things maybe some of your viewers don't know is that many Blacks actually fought in the British Army during the Revolutionary War in order to obtain their freedom. So not only linked to citizenship, but linked to freedom prior to emancipation. And of course, in the Civil War, Frederick Douglass maintains that Blacks couldn't win their freedom if they were not willing to die for it, and convinced also Abraham Lincoln, as did some of his generals on the ground, that they needed blacks to be able to defeat the Confederacy. And similar things happened in the Spanish-American War, and certainly in World War I, that blacks saw this war as an opportunity to perform on a world stage and to prove their worth as soldiers and as men. And so blacks are intent upon making sure that we are included as participants in World War II, and especially in combat roles. And it took a lot of black pressure, once again, to force Congress and the president to actually allow for the volunteering and the drafting of blacks in the military, but also in what kinds of roles. Interestingly, one of the most important players in this process is Hamilton Fish, who was a captain and then major in the 15th New York National Guard and 369th Regiment. As a member of Congress up to 1944, actually created a Fish Amendment, which was supposed to prevent the discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion against any person for service in the United States military.
I can't add to that. I mean, that is a fantastic answer. And I touch upon that in my book, Immortal Valor, as well, that the Double V campaign was begun early on in the war. And, you know, many blacks were asking the question, why should I serve, you know, my country when I'm not a full citizen? And that's a powerful argument. And I know the campaign went on through 1943, and you know, the black soldiers in uniform did know about that. And I want to bring up that the black press was also very active in supporting blacks in the military and seeing them in combat. They were a very strong voice in the Double V campaign, the black press, newspapers, and put a lot of pressure on the Army to make sure that black soldiers did see combat, and they eventually did. But that's a story in and of itself. The strength of the black press, you know, the political pressure they applied to have you know, blacks serve in combat instead of in service roles.
Absolutely. I mean, one such newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, huge in really putting in that pressure and pushing the Double V campaign as well. Now, thinking back to the
Can I say one
documentary.
other thing, Maggie?
Yeah, go for it.
There's another element to the Double V campaign that's really important here, and it brings A. Philip Randolph into the picture. And that's about discrimination within the war industry, defense industry in World War II. And black leaders, especially Randolph, tried to convince Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time, that blacks should be given opportunities to work in the defense industry. And Roosevelt wouldn't budge. And Randolph threatened a march on Washington. And maybe 2 weeks before the scheduled march on Washington to protest the segregation and discrimination in the defense industry, Roosevelt issued an executive order to establish the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which was to allow black participation in the defense industry. And of course, it came with mixed results, but Randolph canceled his march on Washington, didn't come about until 1963. Many people forget that he was a prime mover in the second March on Washington movement, which actually happened with the famous speech, I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King.
And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think oftentimes we do get very wrapped up in the military side of things. Things were happening at home. And as you guys mentioned in the documentary, a lot of things that have been happening at home and at war are going to really impact Black Americans post-war. And so one of those things was President Franklin D. Roosevelt signing legislation for veterans benefits that we know today as the GI Bill. So could you tell us a little bit more about how the GI Bill impacted Black Americans after the war?
Well, the GI Bill called for education and training programs, as well as unemployment programs and loan programs and the loans, especially for housing and the development of businesses. And it was very uneven in its application. Although the language of the GI Bill was colorblind, it was all in the details. And as they say, all politics are local. It was all about local application of and many southern states, and not just the South. There's an interesting story about something that happened in Chicago. This gentleman wanted to go to a college, a liberal arts or science college, and was shunted into a vocational training program. And this wasn't an isolated example. Or in the South, the only place that Blacks could go for education at a post-secondary level was to historically Black institutions. And this overwhelmed the historically Black institutions. They could not accommodate the demand that they had. And in terms of loan, I think there's a story that in Mississippi, not one loan was given for a Black veteran, but in other places as well, the government didn't give the loans, it actually guaranteed the loans. So it was up to financial institutions to give the loans to those who applied, and we know about redlining, etc. Blacks were not getting housing loans. So the GI Bill worked very unevenly. I was talking to a friend whose father built a golf course. He was a veteran in World War II, and he tried to get assistance from the GI Bill and was unsuccessful in that after his military service. So this was a program that actually helped to create and develop the white middle class in America, and also produced a certain kind of citizenship and an attitude toward the government that we haven't seen in war since. We know what's happened to especially Vietnam veterans, but even veterans of the Middle East wars and the Afghan wars, that they don't have the same kind of relationship to the federal government that the veterans of World War II had, or even the veterans of World War I, who had the bonus march and were basically run out of the Capitol, led by MacArthur and the Marines. Herbert Hoover, basically wasn't interested in doing justice to soldiers from World War I. So the World War II soldiers, veterans, are in a different position, and there's a difference in the way whites were treated and Blacks under the GI Bill. Melissa Murray, who was at the University of California Law School and is now at NYU Law School and is clerk for Supreme Court justices, wrote a very interesting article looking at Susan Metzger's study of the bonus or the benefits of the GI Bill. And one of the things he points out is that Metzger just looks at women, white men, and Black men, and doesn't do anything with other Americans of color, Asian Americans, Latino Americans, and that also shows a different story, and they were treated very differently as well than white Americans. So there were protests about the unequal sort of application of the GI Bill, but once again, it was dependent upon the power of local authorities and the attitudes of them to carry out the legislation. And even a place like Levittown, New York, would not allow blacks to live. So, and that's one of the places where many, beneficiaries of the GI Bill would, choose to live. And there are other such Levittowns. There are, Pennsylvania and other places.
One thing I could add to that is the story of Sergeant Edward Carter, one of the Medal of Honor winners that I profiled in my book. Through when he came back to the States as a Distinguished Service Cross recipient, he applied for a loan through the GI Bill to the VA to start a painting business, and he was turned down without explanation. And I'm sure that's not an isolated incident with the Black veterans coming back from World War II being turned down for loan without explanation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm glad we included that section in the film, because people just don't know. That's another thing that people just don't know about.
Exactly. And, talking about the GI Bill, talking about the Double V campaign, it really is, especially taking a look back, incredible at how this really did lay the groundwork for the forthcoming civil rights movement. Now, I'm glad you guys mentioned the Medal of Honor. There were many heroic acts by Black Americans in World War II, and their post-war recommendation packages for awards such as the Bronze Star, Silver Star, the Medal of Honor. Often their awards did not match what their acts were. And of course, there would eventually be a later push to award the Medal of Honor to Black Americans. But could you guys talk a little bit more about this recognition of service, both then and now?
Well, at the time, you're right. A lot of the Black service members definitely deserve the Medal of Honor. And the climate was different as far as prejudice and racism. And a lot of the commanders of the Black soldiers who performed these heroic actions knew that they would not get the Medal of Honor. So they, submitted for the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest medal of valor. So most of the Black soldiers who ended up getting the Medal of Honor 50 years later, in 1997, either won Distinguished Service Cross, or in one instance, the Silver Star, and that was Reuben Rivers. And Reuben Rivers, the reason he didn't receive the Distinguished Service Cross, he was part of the 761st Tank Battalion. The reason he didn't receive the Distinguished Service Cross was because his commander, Captain David Williams, wouldn't relent. He wouldn't put in for the second highest medal. He wanted Reuben to win the highest medal, and he eventually did. And Captain Williams put pressure on the government and military for 50 years to see that Reuben Rivers received the Medal of Honor. So it was very difficult at the time to actually submit a worthy soldier for the Medal of Honor.
I think we might want to say something about why that is. Why in there had been Blacks who received the Medal of Honor in the Civil War and in the Spanish-American War, but not a single Black received the Medal of Honor in World War I until 1991. And that was Freddie Stowers from South Carolina in the 371st Regiment. The Distinguished Service Cross, certainly says that someone has performed heroic actions, but in comparison to it, let me put it another way. It just can't compare to the exclusivity of the Medal of Honor. That is, the most elite fraternity, brotherhood of heroes. 6,600 Distinguished Service Crosses awarded in World War I, less than 100 Medals of Honor. And along with the Medal of Honor, Pershing, General John J. Blackjack Pershing, created 100 Heroes of the War. And so just think what it would mean if a Black were included among this fraternity, and also in this second thing that Pershing created is 100 Heroes of the War, and how that would change perceptions of Black sort of performance in war, that would make the disparagement and the denigration very difficult, because you would be disparaging and denigrating the Medal of Honor as well. So there's no way that they want to recognize Blacks with that highest honor. And we can't, almost no one who doesn't study this stuff can name a person who received the Distinguished Service Cross. But we know from World War I that Sergeant York received a Medal of Honor. We know from World War II that Audie Murphy received one. But I would, pay anyone who's not a scholar or, sort of a deep history buff to name, or a family member to name, Distinguished Service Cross recipients. And of course, in World War II, there's also no one who receives a Medal of Honor at the time. The first, and there will be 7 of them in 1997. And this comes as a result of a systematic study conducted by Shaw University in conjunction with the Department of Defense to do this review of Valor medals. And they conclude that many who should have received them did not, because of one factor: racism. And Rob has, the individuals, Fox and others from the 92nd Division, he can discuss, incredible acts of heroism that went unrecognized, and only one was alive in 1997, Vernon Baker, to receive his Medal of Honor.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and of course, as you mentioned earlier, there's still pushes going on today for Black Americans or Black service members to receive the Medal of Honor now posthumously. One such one I know of off the top of my head, Waverly Woodson of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. So I think it's very important that we're having this conversation and being able to share these stories. I think it's important for our audience to get this full perspective here. Now, as we wrap up our section of this, we're going to get ready to open it up to questions from the public. I do have one last question for you guys. And since you both are published authors, what would you say is the biggest difference and or benefit to telling a story through film instead of written word?
I think the difference for me is with a film, it's a very collaborative effort, because you need a lot of departments to actually create something. You need, the films I've done, you need pyrotechnics, and you need reenactors, and you need, a lot of departments. So it becomes a collaborative effort. Let's get this done. Let's, but in the writing, it's more of a singular effort and a more personal exercise for me. You do have help and you do bring people onto the team, but it's much smaller. You have historians that are vetting the manuscript and archivists and things like that. But it's a very, I found a very singular, sort of lonely pursuit. I love it, but it's not like conducting an orchestra of people and a lot of moving parts. That's what I found.
Well, I can second the loneliness of writing books. Although I had a co-author, but still we often wrote alone, although we collaborated. I like to go at it from a bit of a different angle about the product. Film, of course, compresses, condenses, tends to focus on the individual, less on structure, and it's so wedded to imagery that if you don't have, something, a picture to go along with the subject that you're discussing, that it often doesn't get in. Also doesn't allow for the detail, of course, and documentation of a written text, and in some instances doesn't allow for different points of view that might be there in a different in a text. Not always, because many people write narrative works, but there's still space for multiple points of view within that kind of form. So that's the big difference. And of course, as someone who teaches film courses, a war films course and a sport films course, I never believed that a film should be the last word on anything. That it has to be complemented, supplemented with readings that contextualize the film or develop the story more. Even with Catch 22, I have the students read Heller's novel, but also other works which give a different view of World War II than we're commonly accustomed to. So, but I also realize that, especially with Generation X and Generation Z, that visual stimulation is really important to the learning process. It just has to be backed up with other things.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that you mentioned that. That is one of my own soapboxes about feature films is, make sure you're going back and reading, the books and getting the full picture of it. It's very easy to lose ourselves in such narrow conversations without putting it into context. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to our audience for any questions that they may have. So if you have any questions that you haven't yet submitted, feel free to put them either in the Q&A section if you're watching on Zoom or as a comment on our Facebook video. Now, the first one that I'm going to throw out to you guys is from Facebook, from Jason. It's going back to kind of the beginning of our discussion. So was this unit, the 333rd in particular, slow to get updated equipment as it became available compared to white units?
Traditionally, what I discovered in my research is they got the worst equipment. Black units did get the worst equipment. That wasn't just artillery units. That was also true in tank destroyer units, 614th. They were given, old equipment. John Fox's unit, when they moved from Massachusetts to Virginia, the camp in Virginia, Camp AP Hill. When they came down from Massachusetts, the Army at Camp AP Hill took their well-maintained trucks and gave them battered trucks. So it was not just artillery units, it was across the board, black units that I discovered.
It seems as in some respects they wanted, what I've seen, not only in terms of equipment, but in terms of training, that they wanted blacks to fail. And for blacks to succeed would basically deny them, their arguments about black incompetency and incapacity in warfare. So they did everything in their power And as Rob, you know that the 92nd Division never trained as a division before being deployed
Right.
in World War II. And then it had terrible leaders who seemed to set them up for failure. We know that that happened with the 368th Regiment in World War I. And of course, at a basic level, blacks are the least desirable, the least worthy in the eyes of the military. And, you know, we're going to do the least for them, I think is the attitude that was prevalent at the time.
Absolutely. So building on that and really looking at this concept of neglected support, Denise from Facebook was asking about if you guys were familiar with the 366th in the battle at Somocolonia and the massacre that occurred as a result of the lack of support that they received.
Absolutely. 366 was that battle at Somocolonia was the battle in which John Fox, the Medal of Honor recipient, was killed as an artillery observer. And I don't think it was due to a lack of equipment. It was a lack of personnel. They were undermanned, but they fought in an incredible battle. They were outnumbered almost 3-1 in Somocolonia, his unit, 366. And it's a heartbreaking story, really heartbreaking, because they had units available that could have gone in, American units, but the Germans threw everything at them. It was actually an offensive. It was the German offensive called Winter Thunderstorm, and they were just surrounded and taken out.
Can you tell what John Fox did, Rob?
Sure. John Fox won the Medal of Honor. He was an artillery observer attached to 360. It was with the 598. And he was in the tower, La Rocca Tower in Somocolonia. And he saw what was happening because he was calling in artillery all morning since 4:30 in the morning. And finally, it got so bad that the Germans were overrunning his position, and he had nothing he could do. So he called back to the fire control center and said, I want you to fire on my position. He requested that the artillery fire on his tower. And they said no at first. And we can't do that. We can't fire on your position, John. We won't fire on our own men. So it went up immediately to channels to a general, General Truscott, and they asked him if he would approve firing on John Fox's position. And it came back, yes, they would. So John Fox, who won the Medal of Honor, called the artillery on his own position, and he perished. And this is one of the Black Medal of Honor winners in the book Mortal Valor. And it's an incredible story. And from my research, the soldiers in the 92nd knew about that story within 24 hours. It was all over the Mediterranean theater. And it was unbelievable. And after the artillery was fired on his position, there were 2 salvos. The white commander said, we will have a minute of silence in honor of John Fox. So there was a minute of silence after the second salvo, which kind of gives you chills that someone would do that, but he did it.
And he also was an officer. So this stuff about black officers not being able to lead, not having courage, not being willing to sacrifice, is belied by John Fox's story.
Absolutely. Yeah. His first lieutenant.
Absolutely. It's an incredible story. And one of the things that Chris from Facebook brings up is that when he was growing up, he was only aware of the Red Ball Express, which, I mean, you had the Red Ball Express in the Tuskegee Airmen. You have these specific stories, but you don't hear a lot about stories like Fox. But his question in particular is looking more at the known history of the Tuskegee Airmen. Were they not talked about so much until it was the movie that finally made us aware of what was going on? Is it similar to what you guys have been doing with the documentary Serving for Justice and the books that you guys are doing? Were the Tuskegee Airmen just not widely known about until it entered into, I guess, for a lack of a better term, pop culture?
I don't know. There's always someone, I know they were popular before the movie, the Tuskegee Airmen, but there's always someone who's pushing the story. You know, there's always a vocal person who says, you got to know the story. And I think that was part of the reason. There was someone was very vehement about, let's tell this story, let's get this history out there. But Jeff, you probably know
No,
about.
I really don't know how it got out there, except there were lots of living veterans of the Tuskegee Airmen. And of course, General Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who was the commander as a captain of the Tuskegee Airmen, would become a four-star general. So he's also a well-known figure. There were a number of ceremonies around the Tuskegee Airmen at sporting events before the film. I think the film sort of piggybacked on the popularity of the Tuskegee Airmen more than making them, you know, popular. They understood their popularity and that it would help to, you know, make the film a success, a monetary success. There's something else I was going to say about but they're sort of, you know, because they flew, because they were in pursuit, that there was a glamorous, there's a sort of romantic element to the Tuskegee Airmen. Also, Eleanor Roosevelt was involved. She went to Tuskegee and made sure that she was photographed in a plane, having flown with Anderson, one of the instructors, for an hour, and went back to Washington and said, you've got to do something. And that's a whole another story about how the Tuskegee Airmen came about, because the Army Air Corps did everything in their power not to have blacks flying as military pilots. And once again, pressure was brought to bear by black leadership and the press to force the military to include black aviators. But there's something that you know, about flyers that you know, is going to make them sort of stand out. And so the Tuskegee Airmen, but also they've you know, have organizations, meetings, reunions, etc. So they kept themselves within, I think, the public's attention.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. So a question we had from Zoom from Lawrence, building on this topic of the Tuskegee Airmen, and this will be the last question on that before we switch back. They were flying P-51s. Was there a reason why they were given some of the newer aircraft instead of older ones? Was it because of this glamour, because of they had earned, you know, their spot in the war? Or any thoughts on that?
I'm not an expert on airplanes, but I just read something where they flew more than P-51s. I think 49 and other numbers. So I can't. John Morrow, my co-author, who's also a military aviation historian for World War I and World War II, would know better. I can't answer that question about why they might have gotten the equipment that they did, although their role was a very dangerous one of flying pursuit missions to protect bombers and other aircraft.
Right.
Absolutely. So another question from Facebook from Jason is, did Axis propaganda exploit the poor treatment of minority units by the Allies?
And specifically? Does it give an example?
No, here's just asking, is a general question
What
about,
was the question again, Maggie?
so did Axis propaganda exploit the poor treatment of minority units?
I know they did in World War One. They actually dropped leaflets on the battlefields of World War One, asking Black soldiers, "Why are you fighting for the United States when they treat you as you do?" And I'm sure Tokyo Rose was saying things about Black soldiers and their treatment in World War II. As a matter of fact, there were Blacks who were actually supportive of the Japanese in World War II because of the treatment. So I'm certain that there was propaganda directed, especially by the Japanese at Black soldiers.
They knew about the Black soldiers in the 92nd Division coming in Mediterranean theater, and that contributed to the attack. I mentioned before the offensive winter thunderstorm. They felt like they had a chance with the untested Black combat soldiers. So they knew about the when the Black soldiers came into the line, but I didn't see anything in my research about propaganda. I wasn't focused on that either.
I understand that. And because we're coming close to the end of the hour, this is going to be our last question, even though we do have quite a few more coming in. From David on Zoom. So how can so many people not see the systemic bias against people of color? The treatment of people of color in the Civil War, World War II, the GI Bill, and so forth. And it's still happening till this day. What will it take for it to be acknowledged and then corrected?
Well, it's a slow process. And in the 90s, it was a big step forward for the Army, for the military to recognize that there was an issue and commissioned a study at Shaw University. So I think that was a good step, excellent step. But, we're not fully there. So it's not something like a switch that's going to happen overnight. It's constant vigilance to recognize that there's still an issue. But what I've found, there's a context here. People don't realize how poorly Black soldiers were treated in World War II. They just assume that they were, part of, the service battalions, but, not in the war, but they don't know that. But they were treated so poorly on every level by the white officers, by every section, so that today we've come so far, tremendously far, that we're not there yet, but it has improved. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, where do I begin with this? Following World War II, there was a push to integrate the military. And of course, the film mentions Truman's executive order, which comes in 1948, but it doesn't mention what it took to get that executive order. And in fact, once again, A. Philip Randolph and Grant Reynolds urged a boycott of the military by Blacks until the military was integrated. So actual integration, although, the order is in 1948, doesn't come until 1950 or 51 in Korea. And then there are other forms of discrimination. How are Blacks deployed? And in Vietnam, we know that they were put in the most dangerous positions. What about general officers? How many Black general officers are they? What are they in command positions, et cetera? So there are other forms of discrimination as well, even though the military is now integrated. So the military, by many accounts, is the most meritocratic institution in the United States, the most integrated. But as we see with women, it still has some very serious issues. And when I say with women, it's only until recently that women were allowed to be considered as combat soldiers and or in combat roles, but also the sexual harassment and assault that takes place in the military against women. Their treatment is not good. And of course, the military now is more a poor person's army, in that it's an all volunteer army. So people who are looking for, steady employment, health benefits, et cetera, are drifting toward the military. So it skews, I think, the representation, the demographics toward, minorities who would come from, the lowest socioeconomic levels in many respects. So, that's my answer to that question.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Rob, and thank you, Dr. Sammons, for taking the time to discuss this documentary in the context around it, looking at the history of World War II from the Black service members' perspective. I really appreciated it, and I know that our audience has as well. I encourage each of you who is watching to, if you have not already, to watch Serving for Justice. It's available on Amazon Prime Video. It's available to rent or to purchase. And if you enjoyed today's program, continue to stay up to date with upcoming programs from the National World War II Museum by liking our Facebook page and visiting our website. And as always, we thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time here at the National World War II Museum.